Welcome. This is the EEOST Capital Fund Information Session. Thank you for taking the time to participate in this session. My name is Teresa Jordan. I am the Director of the Children's Investment Fund. I just want to go over a few logistics before we get started. All attendees are on mute. The chat function is disabled because we will be using the Q&A function instead. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you want to ask any questions as we go through. We encourage you to submit any questions that you have through that process. We may address some of those questions throughout the webinar by typing our answers into the Q&A, but we will also have time for a live Q&A at the end of the hour. So we will definitely make sure that we have time to answer any questions live. We will be recording this webinar. The slides will be shared with all of you that have registered afterwards, and we will also post on to Combise the slides where you found the application documents. Also, I'd like to just note that these grants are for center-based nonprofit programs only, so family child care providers and for-profit center-based organizations are not eligible for this funding. This funding also this is an information session for the large grant round for grants up to $1 million. Mass Development will be managing the small grant round for EEOST, and those grants are between $250,000 and $500,000, and they will host their own information session in mid-January, which is next week. And that information is also on Combise and EEC's website, so you can get the link to sign up for that information, those information sessions for the small grant round. Next slide, please. So this is our second information session. The first one was held on December 16th. Any questions and our responses for both sessions will be posted to Combise by around January 22nd. We expect all questions to be submitted by January 15th, and a week later, we would like to post the responses to all of your questions. So as you're preparing your application, you have those responses. The purpose of this information session is really to discuss the eligibility requirements for the large grant EEOST program, again, for nonprofit center-based organizations. We will go through the pre-application process, the grant conditions. We'll talk about the application process as well. And I know you don't have those documents, but we will go through that as well. And we'll talk about the timeline, which is really, really important. And again, at the end, we will answer any questions that you have. My colleagues that are presenting with me today are Bree Horowitz and Jasenia Gill, and then also Kira Wilkie and Cheyenne Griffin are here from the Children's Investment Fund as well. And I will now turn it over to Bree. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So this is the 12th year of the Early Education and Out of School Time Capital Grant Program, which was created in 2013. This grant program has $45 million authorized for the first 5 years that took it through fiscal year 18. It was reauthorized in fiscal year 18 for another 5 years, and most recently reauthorized in 2024 with another $50 million as part of the Affordable Homes Act. The EEOST Capital Grant Program provides grants to tax-exempt nonprofit organizations, as Teresa mentioned. At least 50% of the slots in the facility must serve low-income families who are eligible for public subsidies, as per the legislation that created the grant program. In this presentation, we'll talk about how you calculate that 50% affordable slots. Since the first round in fiscal year 14, the state has invested over $70 million in 147 projects throughout the state. The Commonwealth's Executive Office of Administration and Finance has authorized up to $5 million in grant funding in fiscal year 26 for the large grant round program. So $5 million available in this grant round. EEC has designated the Community Economic Development Assistance Corporation, CEDAC, to administer the large grant program. As Teresa mentioned, Mass Development will be administering the small grant program, which we'll talk about momentarily. The Children's Investment Fund is an affiliate of CEDAC, and we provide technical assistance, financing, and training to early education and out-of-school time facilities across Massachusetts. We are a CDFI, a Community Development Financial Institution, that works with many of the organizations that apply for EEOST throughout the year. CEDAC and CIF are contracted to review the large grant round applications and provide the recommendations to EEC. As Teresa mentioned, Mass Development is managing the small grant round with applications due February 13th, 2026. Here we'll drop the information in the chat, but all the materials are available on Combis, and you can reach out to them with questions. An organization is able to apply for both the large and the small grant rounds if they are eligible to do so. If you have questions about that, please reach out to Mass Development and to EEC. In terms of eligible organizations, in order to apply for EEOST, the organization needs to have an existing license from EEC. So that means that even if it's a new site that you're creating with the EEOST grant fund, you need to have an existing licensed child care program. None of the individuals working at your organization or who are affiliated with your organization through the board can benefit in any way from the EEOST Capital Fund. What that means is that, and we'll talk about this, that it's a conflict of interest for you to hire one of your board members as a paid professional on the project. If you happen to have a board member who is an architect or who has other skills that could benefit the project, they are allowed to work on the project as long as they are not a paid member of the team. Again, we'll talk about that further. Organizations must be can you go back one slide, please? Must be organized under the Mass General Laws, Chapter 180, as exempt from federal income tax. We will talk about partnerships in a minute, but the main organization must be a nonprofit organized under Chapter 180. Next slide, please. So partnerships are allowed with the EEOST Capital Grant Program as long as there is a nonprofit entity that has a controlling interest in the partnership, meaning that they have at least 51% controlling interest. At the time of the pre-application, the organizations must have a memorandum of understanding or other document that explains the relationship between the two entities. Again, if you have any questions about eligibility or potential relationship or partnership, please feel free to email us and we'd be happy to talk about it prior to the pre-application. Again, at the time of the pre-application, you'll need to submit organizational documents. And again, none of the members of either partner organization can directly benefit from the EEOST grant. Next slide, please. So I encourage everyone to take a look at the guidelines, which are posted on Combis, but as outlined in the guidelines, an eligible facility for an EEOST grant would be a site that complies with all statutory regulations, ordinances. Projects need to meet ADA and Mass Architectural Access Board requirements. They need to comply with the building code, and they need to serve at least 50% low-income families as of the date of the application. So the definition of low-income families includes families who directly receive EEC or Head Start subsidies, or any one of a number of other public subsidies that are income tested. So these include Mass Health, Section 8, SNAP benefits, The application materials and the guidelines specify what those subsidies are. It's important to note that universal pre-K does not count as a public subsidy for this purpose, as that is not an income tested requirement. If you have any questions about this part of the eligibility, please reach out to us. We're happy to talk. If you are creating a new site, then your organization at the time of the pre-application needs to demonstrate that you serve at least 50% affordable slots throughout all of your licensed centers at the time of the pre-application. And again, the documents explain this in more detail, and we can answer any questions at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. So what is different than the small round is that in application, I apologize. So applicants must own or lease the facility at the time of the pre-application. What this means is that if you are planning to acquire the site over the next year, over the EEOST review period, which is from the time of the pre-application submission through the time that the EEC makes announcements in September 2026. You need to demonstrate that you have site control. So if you're purchasing a building, if you are in an agreement to purchase a building, that is okay, as long as at the time of the pre-application, you're able to provide documentation that shows that you have site control through and beyond September 2026. You can have a purchase and sale that goes beyond that date and actually acquire the site at any time during that period. But the reason why it's important for you to show that you have extended site control throughout that entire period of the EEOST review is because you will not have an ability to update the EEOST review team that you have acquired the site. The only time that you'll be able to update the review team on the project is when you apply for the pre-application, and if the project is invited to come in for a full application, there will be a site visit. But other than that, we need to be able to rely on the documentation that you submit at the time of the pre-application. If you're planning to lease the site, then you need to be able to demonstrate that you have a lease period that's at least 15 years. If that's from a private landlord. If you are leasing from a public entity, such as the city, you need to be able to demonstrate that the lease is at least 25 years. Next slide, please. So the 15 years and the 25 years we'll talk about in a moment in terms of the site control period, but you can use the EEOST grant to purchase a site. Unlike the small grant round, you can use the EEOST grant to repair, expand, complete construction, or renovate an eligible facility. The soft costs that you spend, so the professionals you hire, the tests and assessments that you will perform, all of those costs are eligible uses under the grant. Projects cannot be 100% complete during the review period of the EEOST large grant. Again, this differs from the small grant round. So what this means is that you can start construction on the project during the EEOST review period as long as it is not complete by the time EEC makes announcements, which is estimated to be September 2026. If the project is part of a phased approach or a multi-year project, that is acceptable as long as you are able to explain within the pre-application and the full application the full timeline of the project. And the EEOST component of the project cannot be completed during the review period. Happy to answer any questions about that. Now, in terms of the term for EEOST, the large grant round carries a land use restriction period of 25 years for projects that are leased from a municipality or owned, or 15 years if they're leased from a private landlord. Unlike the small grant round, there is a recorded land use restriction and mortgage. The mortgage is not like a mortgage you might have on your residential home in terms of a loan that you repay, but it serves so that at any point in the future, if there's an event of default or if your organization ceases to provide childcare, that the state has an opportunity to step in and help remedy the situation, either by assisting with financial resources or identifying another provider to take over the lease. This is fully explained within the grant agreement and the documents that you will sign if you are awarded the grant during closing. Next slide, please. So in terms of recapture, repayment, again, this serves if there's an event of default. The organization would repay the grant in a prorated method over the years. So if there's an event that happens further down the line, a portion of the grant would then be repaid so that the funds could then be reinvested in another program. So it's 15 years, again, for projects that are leased, or 25 years for projects that are owned or are leasing their spaces from a municipality. Next slide, please. So the amount of the grant award, organizations can apply for up to $1 million per project. The least amount you can apply for is $500,000. The project cost needs to be more than the amount that you are applying for, but there is no match requirement. In other words, if you are applying for the $1 million for EEOST, you don't need to demonstrate that you have $1 million in other resources. And often programs will apply for the maximum amount of EEOST, and then pay for the rest through private lending, through fundraising, through their own internal equity. So projects, in order to be competitive, need to be able to show that they will have enough funds to start the project within a year of the award if they are awarded funds. My colleague Jasenia will talk about the other sources that are typically in these projects and also how you demonstrate that you have them at the time of the pre-application and the full application. Again, projects cannot be 100% complete during that review period through September 2026. Next slide, please. So organizations that received a grant in the first years of the EEOST grant program, so fiscal year of 14 through 2020, or received a large grant in fiscal year 2024-25, again, those are grants up to $1 million, are not eligible to apply for this year's large grant round for the same site. So if you had a site on Main Street that received an award in any of those years, $1 million reward, $1 million grant award, you cannot apply for that same site on Main Street for this grant. However, if your organization received a small grant for the same site for the years 2021 through 25, so those are grants up to $500,000, then you can apply. If you have any questions at all, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk about eligibility. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jasenia, to talk about more information on the application process and scoring.
Thank you, Bree. Good morning, Happy New Year, and good luck on your applications to anyone who is submitting an application as part of this round. Let's talk project readiness. So readiness and feasibility are the largest areas the project will be scored upon. Ready projects are those that demonstrate that they have the ability, as Bree mentioned, to raise necessary funding, produce finalized plans and specifications, secure all necessary public approvals, and be completed within 24 months of the grant award. Ready projects are feasible at the time of application or have a credible plan in place to achieve feasibility within 12 months of the award date. And feasibility usually entails financial feasibility, both from a capital and operating standpoint, regulatory feasibility, which means you'll meet all of EEC, building code, zoning, accessibility, and environmental requirements. A successful applicant should also demonstrate that they have sufficient financial stability and management capacity to plan and implement the proposed project. And site control is another important aspect of readiness. The applicant should either already own the site or have secured site control for the useful life of the renovation or construction of the project. And that site control must be secured prior to the pre-application and extend through the review period, or at least through September of 2026. Next slide, please. In terms of the grant disbursement, EEOST funds are dispersed after a grantee receives an award and closes on that grant. The EEOST funds are dispersed on a reimbursement basis for expenses that are related to the project incurred as of a year prior to the pre-application, or February 5th of 2025. An exception to that would be any projects that include acquisition of property. Those projects can include their costs incurred up to 2 years prior to the pre-application, or February of 2024. Grantees are fully responsible for legal costs incurred to close the EEOST grant. And we typically say include at least $5,000 in your budget for the EEOST attorney, in addition to any additional expenses for your counsel as well. Those costs should be included in your proposed budget. All projects must complete a financial closing and start construction within 1 year of the award, or September of 2027. Next slide, please. The projects that are part of the large grant are really large, they're complex, and typically need input from a full team of professionals. Of course, every project is different, so a full team of professionals may mean something different to your project compared to another project. But typically, the projects we like to see in terms of professionals that in all respects, you're conducting a community review, approval process, resolve permitting and zoning requirements. You're completing planning, design, and engineering activities. You will receive bidding and construction management and coordinate grant closing and other legal transactions. That is what an owner's project manager can help you during the pre-development phase. So that would be one part of the team that is actually required as part of this grant, to have an owner's project manager that can assist with all of those pre-development activities. An architect, for instance, you may need to ensure compliance with accessibility and other codes. A landscape architect or a place-based designer if you're working or your project is a playground, or your project includes renovation of a facility and a playground. Certainly highly recommended to include as part of your team. And you may need various engineers depending on your scope of work, including mechanical engineers to assess systems and buildings, structural engineers for major construction projects, and site engineers to assess water management as it relates to the site, but also a playground. And you may also need a real estate attorney if you are undergoing zoning or in need of any regulatory approvals. The team, as part of this grant process, should be in place in the pre-development phase. And typically we require that they are in place 3 months as of the pre-application submittal. All projects must assemble an experienced and competent team. We really want to ensure that the project can be successfully completed and that you're surrounded by an appropriate team of professionals to help you achieve that. Next slide, please. As mentioned, a construction project manager or owner's project manager is a requirement of the grant. And actually one of the most critical development team members is the owner's project manager. The project manager typically will help you engage experienced professionals, ensure that you're using high quality materials in your construction, help you retain architects that are familiar with licensed childcare spaces. So they certainly play a critical role in terms of pre-development, but also throughout the entire development cycle. So certainly an owner's project manager is an essential part of your team, and as mentioned, part of this grant requirement. In the event that the grantee elects to change a project manager during the course of the grant award, we typically ask that you notify us in writing or 30 calendar days prior to an effective date of change. As you can imagine, changing such a critical component to your team could certainly have an impact on the project. And so we want to, just be informed and provide any assistance that we can as you transition to a new project manager. I want to remind anyone who is applying for the grant that the expense of an owner's project manager, a construction manager, or clerk of works to monitor construction is an eligible EEOST grant expense, so be sure to include it in your project budget. Next slide, please. In terms of total development costs, Bree touched upon this briefly, but minimum to apply for the large grant is $500,000. There is certainly no maximum total development cost, but the minimum to apply for the large grant is a total development cost of $500,000. Anything below that, of course, there is another wonderful resource, which is the small grant program administered through Mass Development, and you can certainly reach out to them for information on that. In terms of what can be included in your total development costs, developer fees and developer overhead are allowed, but we do want to see that it does not exceed 5% of your total TDC, and you can use overhead to reimburse some of the staff time that is allocated to the project. Bids for construction as part of the total development costs budget are required. However, at the time of pre-application, we are not looking for 3 bids. Certainly, if you are awarded a grant and you're going through the bidding process, we would require that you do seek 3 competitive bids. No procurement policies are required as part of our grant program, like prevailing wage or union labor, unless there are other aspects of the project that require that. Could be federal resources that may trigger that. In that case, we certainly will follow that. But in terms of the EEOST grant, prevailing wage or union labor is not required. We do, however, require an arm's length transaction. Bree again touched upon this briefly. It just means that you cannot hire board members, family members for compensated roles within the project. They can certainly volunteer, but it has to be an unpaid role. You can use volunteer advisors, but we recommend only using paid professionals for the EEOST project. And as mentioned, most of the paid professional roles are eligible to be reimbursed under the EEOST grant program. Next slide, please. And in terms of proposed contractors, we certainly like to see that you are working with a general contractor that has comparable experience in the work that you're undertaking. So we certainly recommend going out to bid and or interviewing several general contractors as you begin to select the GC. As part of this grant program, the GC not only should have adequate experience in the scope of work that you're undertaking, but they should have sufficient capacity because they will need to carry payment, performance, and lien bonds, as well as present lien waivers at time of requisition. So they should be familiar with that process, but also have sufficient financial capacity, again, to carry a payment, performance, and lien bond, which is required. As in an alternative to a payment, performance, and lien bond, they can certainly obtain a letter of credit for a minimum of 15% of the construction contract. But that, again, certainly requires a financial capacity to be able to do that. And then in terms of the bid process, we certainly recommend that you reach out to contractors on the state supplier diversity office program, and you certainly get preference points for using contractors that are approved through the SDO and STP, but it's certainly not mandatory. Next slide, please. In terms of the application process, Kira will drop into the chat the Combis link. If you have not already visited the Combis, clicked on the link and visited the page with all of the grant documents, we certainly recommend that you do so. Review the procurement information. It has all of the criteria for submitting a pre-application, which is the precursor to a full application. EEC requires that all applicants intending to apply for this funding submit a pre-application first. And as you can tell from that slide, the pre-application is due on February 5th by 11:59 p.m. You will receive confirmation emails when you submit your application through our electronic online platform called Cognito Forms. Cognito Forms, this platform allows you to not only submit your application electronically, but also upload any supporting documentation. When you do submit the application, you will receive an email, not just when you close out every single time you're inputting data or uploading documentation, but once you submit the application itself before February 5th by 11:59 p.m., you will receive an email indicating that your application has been submitted. Please save each page as you go. I think it's a great document to archive as evidence that you've been in and out of the application, but also that you submitted it on time before the close date at midnight, or before midnight rather. Please ensure you do not hit the submit button after midnight. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the pre-application, again, pre-application due date is February 5th, 2026, before 11:59 p.m. Once the pre-application is submitted through the Cognito Forms, EEC will conduct a preliminary review to determine whether each eligible facility has a license in good standing with the department, is in good financial standing with EEC. And then at that point, any eligible applications are transmitted to CDAC or CIF for review and evaluation. Failure to submit a pre-application will preclude an organization from submitting a full grant application. Again, the pre-application is the first step. Only those organizations that receive an invitation to apply from EEC will be allowed to submit a full EEOST capital fund application. In addition, those organizations that are not invited to submit a full application will certainly receive a notification indicating that. So in either case, you will hear whether you are invited to the full round or if we would like to see you apply in another round. If the pre-application or application is missing any of the attachments at the time it is filed with EEC, unfortunately, the application will be ineligible for EEOST consideration. So please ensure that you are uploading all the required documents. Make sure you meet all the criteria. Applicants that aren't eligible won't be reviewed during this round. Again, there could be another round in which you could reapply. But as you're going through the process, just make sure that you're dotting your I's, crossing your T's, uploading all the supporting documentation that is required with the application itself. And again, applications and attachments are all submitted electronically through the Cognito Forms platform. Next slide, please. When we receive the pre-application, we will conduct a preliminary review, and then we will begin to score your application based on the capital project, the criteria rather, the readiness criteria. You will see that on your slide. We typically look at 6 areas of readiness: site control, pre-development and planning, plans and specifications, project financing, organizational financing, and of course, standing with EEC, which is really the first step. It comes into EEC, and then they will determine eligibility, and then we would score on the other 5 categories. Next slide, please. All electronic, the pre-application is all electronic, and again, needs to be submitted before midnight, 11:59 p.m. to be exact. We'll receive automated confirmations of the email, an automated confirmation through email that the application has been submitted on your end and received on our end. Pre-application is typically just narrative about the aspects of your project and includes sending 1 year of audited financials, preliminary budgets, evidence of site control, plans, as well as cost estimates. We typically ask that you explain where your project stands at that point in time. And as I mentioned prior, through a prior slide, you're not required to have multiple bids, but certainly we would like to see minimum 1 professionally bid cost estimate. And each estimate should include the company name and date of the estimate. Each estimate should break out the cost of materials and labor and include a construction timeline. And 1 cost estimate per area of work is required. For example, if you're undertaking an HVAC project, we certainly would want to see a cost estimate for that scope of work. And a playground project, for instance, we would want to see a separate estimate for the playground scope of work. If you can collect 2 or 3 cost estimates for each area of work, certainly that makes your application more competitive. Again, not required at the pre-application phase, but does make your application more competitive, and certainly helps inform the reasonableness of the pricing that you are seeking. Project deemed eligible will be invited to apply in April for a June submission date. If you have any questions, please email us. Let's see. Now, on the next slide, you will see documents that are posted in Combise. If you want to review them prior to entering data into Cognito forms, that can certainly be a method that you could use to just walk through the application one time and be efficient as you're entering data into the Cognito forms. But that is completely up to you. The documents, however, are there for you to review prior to submitting through Cognito forms. However, the application spreadsheets, which is an Excel document, that has to be filled out and uploaded. There isn't an area on the electronic application for you to submit that data. It has to be a separate document, an Excel spreadsheet that you upload. And we'll certainly talk through that, some of the Excel tabs shortly. Next slide, please. In terms of the full application, it is due Tuesday, June 4th, 2026 by 11:59 p.m. The full application typically asks for additional and more detailed due diligence, including project timeline, among other things. We ask for environmental reports, capital needs assessments, if required, and other assessments depending on the scope of work of your project. We also ask for 3 years of audited financials. Part of the process is that we have an in-person site visit to tour the project and also to have an opportunity to meet your team and to fully discuss the project. And typically that takes place in June or July. It's usually around 2.5 hours to visit the site and meet with your team. And we also bring our EEOST review team, which typically consists of an architect, a project manager, and a construction reviewer to help us fully understand the technical aspects of your project. At that point, we give your team the opportunity to provide any updates changes since the application was submitted, or to review any plans that have been moved along further than originally submitted with your application. After the site visit, unfortunately, there's no further discussion until announcements are made in September, because we typically go into our review process and work on our recommendations to EEC. Next slide, please. The next slide shows the criteria as well as the maximum points that are available in each criteria. As mentioned, there are 6 that we typically look at. The first one is accurate presentation, documentation of project costs, and you can be awarded up to 25 points in that area. What we'd like to see is certainly accurate presentation of costs, supporting documents that clearly show the project, and that can include photos, documentation, a description of the project to be completed, estimates. We want to see your estimates, your plans, reports demonstrating that you've explored all of the potential challenges that your project may encounter, including environmental. Criteria number 2 is readiness and feasibility. Again, maximum points up to 25 in that category. We're really looking at your readiness to close and start construction by September of 2027. We asked you to describe the process to achieving permitting and zoning, and again, showing us that you are ready to close and start construction by September 2027. Criteria number 3 is organizational financial stability, and that is up to 25 points. We will just review audits as well as your operating projections to look at the stability of your organization. Criteria number 4, site consideration, up to 10 points. You need to demonstrate at the pre-application stage that you do have site control, but in the grant application, we are also looking at the site as it relates to appropriateness for a program. Does it have adequate outdoor play space? Are you addressing any known environmental or site conditions, such as wetlands or historic considerations? Are you demonstrating appropriate acquisition costs if that is part of your grant application? And that you're certainly demonstrating that all the transaction is an arm's length transaction as it relates to site acquisition or any potential lease arrangements. And then, of course, number 5, social vulnerability index adjustment, or SVI. You can gain up to 4 points in that category. And that is just relates to the project site location. So it's your address, nothing more, nothing less. We would input it into the database and determine where it falls under the social vulnerability index adjustment factor. Number 6 are preferences. There are 7 preference areas, which I will just go over in the next slide, please. And those preferences are determined by EEC and will be given to eligible projects that reflect either a balanced geographic plan with emphasis given to Central Mass, Southeastern Mass, Cape Cod, and the islands. Facilities that are meeting at least 80% of the site's enrollment for low-income families. The threshold is 50%, but if you're above 80 or more, then certainly you will be allocated some additional points there as a preference. Programs serving EEC's priority populations, which are homeless children, families in supportive childcare, or children of teen parents. Project accessibility, so any projects addressing special needs. If your site is located in a gateway city, again, if you are using any vendors that are certified through STO or SDP. And finally, if your organization has never received an EEOST grant, you would be allocated some additional points there. And then in terms of the timeline, note that the full round wraps up with announcements in September. Projects cannot be completed before 2026 to be eligible. And projects have 12 months after award to complete pre-development work and move into closing. And of course, you have 2 years to complete construction. As Bree touched upon earlier, if it's a phase project, then the other aspects of the project can be completed, just not the EEOST part of the project. The next 4 slides I will go through pretty quickly. These are the slides that are in that Excel spreadsheet that I referenced. There are charts that would need to be completed with the application. The first one that you see is the development budget. You are only seeing the top half of the Excel spreadsheet. There are more categories there, but this is where you would input all of your hard costs for the project. And again, an owner's project manager or GC, if you are working with one, can certainly help you put together the development budget. The next slide you see is the sources and uses. This is where you will tell us the uses for your project, both on the hard cost side and soft cost side. All of your professionals that you're hiring, furniture, fixtures and equipment, all of that would go on the left-hand side under the uses, including your legal costs, which I mentioned earlier, not just to close the EEOST grant, but your own attorney fees for your organization should go on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you will tell us how you're going to pay for this amazing project. So you'll want to list out all of your sources, and that can come in many forms, as Bree mentioned: debt, internal equity, grants, private funds. You will spell out all of the funds that you either have in hand or anticipate raising to fund the project. You will notice on this spreadsheet that there's a status column, and there is a key at the top that allows you to follow how to enter that column in terms of status. It's proposed, letter of interest, application pending, and commitment. I certainly recommend, as you're completing this, to please keep an eye on that and let us know where things stand in terms of your fundraising. And so please remember to fill that piece out. And then finally, what I would say about the sources and uses is that it should balance. Sometimes we do see that this budget does not balance. You may have more uses or sources. And so at the end of the day, both columns should total. And then finally, the slot subsidy data. When you are filling this out, please count one slot as an individual child in the charts, even if that child attends part-time. If the total current slot exceeds license capacity because of the part-time children, you can just add a note below. There's a section on the Excel spreadsheet that allows you to add narrative. We would certainly recommend that you do that. As you can see on this slide, this organization is not meeting the threshold of 50% affordability. And our next slide will certainly explain how you can attain that 50% minimum. Next slide, please. If you are not meeting the 50% threshold, certainly you can look to the families that you are serving to determine if they're receiving other public subsidies. And on the spreadsheet, there is a comprehensive list of everything that we determine as another public subsidy. As of note, UPK, or Universal Pre-Kindergarten funding, as Bree mentioned earlier, is not a public subsidy for the purpose of the grants, simply because it is not a means-tested program. And so one way to determine if families are receiving any of those public subsidies is to take an anonymous poll of your families prior to applying to determine if they are receiving any of the subsidies listed. We typically do not ask for individual family incomes or verification that you completed the poll, but we do ask that you keep it on file if it is ever needed in the future. That is all. I know it was a lot of information, but I will pass it back to Teresa.
Great. Thanks, Jasenia and Bree. So please email us if you want to discuss any real estate development aspects of your project. We can set up a time to meet with you, or we can do it over email, whichever is easiest for you. And if you have any specific questions about the EEOST process, please email Jose Mendez or Ellen Song, who are both at EEC and managing this program as well. And please send those questions by January 15th. And the responses will be posted on or around January 22nd. And so now we'll move to the question and answer session with Kira and the team.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. Hi, everyone. I'm also with the Children's Investment Fund team. Thanks for all your questions. We're going to try to get to all of them. I think we're happy to stay on a little bit longer. Just to say, if you didn't have your question fully answered, please do email us at the emails that I put in the last chat. I can send it again in a bit, but these are all great questions. Another common question is just to clarify that we will send the slides over email after the session. They will be posted on EEC's website and COMBI's, that state procurement site. And someone asked about the recording. We'll work with EEC to try to put the recording up on EEC's website too, because I know it's helpful to go back and reference those documents. Bree, is there a requirement for how much funding and other sources must be allocated? I had answered that there's no real technical matching funds requirement, but what else would you say about that?
No, there is no requirement. Basically, in terms of presenting the most competitive project at the time of the pre-app, and then if you're invited in for the full application, you want to be able to explain what sources you're seeking to fund the project and the timeline, your strategy to get them, how you'll bridge any sources that do not come in. And particularly with the full application, you want to demonstrate that if the project is awarded EEOST, you will have sources in hand to start construction within a year. So those can be temporary or bridge sources such as bridge loans or, against a capital campaign, if you have pledges coming in over a longer period of time. We're happy to discuss that, but you do not need cash in hand in order to apply for EEOST and present a competitive application.
Thanks. And also for you, Bree, someone talked about consultant costs prior to applying. So I put the date in that after February 5th, 2025, you can include those in your budget and theoretically get reimbursed for some of those consultant costs. But this person also mentioned that they had started some of the work, such as demolition. So can you just talk about the timing of starting the work versus completing the work during the review time?
Yes. So again, eligible costs for EEOST reimbursement are up to a year prior to the pre-application. If you acquire the site, you can go back 2 years prior to the pre-application. If you have spent that money prior to that point, you can count that as part of your project budget. It's just you cannot use EEOST funds to directly reimburse for those expenses. So in terms of the work, it is really common that you would do work like demo work or other analysis of your site, other testing of your site beforehand. Those costs, again, can go towards your overall project budget, but depending on the timing of it, they may not be eligible for reimbursement. So you would have to use another source to pay for that. You can do the demo and other work during that review period, which again goes until EEC makes announcements, which is likely to be September 2026, or we say the fall of 2026. It's not an exact date. So the project would be an eligible project as long as the entire EEOST funded project is not complete by that point.
Great. Jasenia, from our CDEC CIF's perspective, what are the top characteristics of strong EEOST large grant applications? These are a couple related questions. Are there common mistakes or red flags that otherwise applicants should avoid? How do reviewers balance the project readiness with the community need and the community impact? A lot there, but what could you say about that?
Yes, that certainly seems like a three-pronged question. In terms of competitiveness at the pre-application phase, I would say that organizations are coming in with some planning already taken place. They have an appropriate team, a development team in place for their project as required through the grant application to work with them 3 months in advance, which means at that point you have potentially plans, whether they're a schematic level or more advanced. We like to see that it is a bit more advanced than schematic. That certainly would put you in a more competitive place. That you've thought through the budget, which means you're working with professionals to get competitive and accurate bidding to put together a development budget. And then finally, that you've thought through the sources and uses. You've identified you don't need to have the full capital stack in place at pre-application or application, but you need to have a credible plan on how you're going to fund the project through the different sources that are available to the project. As Bree mentioned, it could be internal, it could be debt, it could be bridge financing. There are just many forms. So really having a credible plan to put together the capital stack, have a team already in place doing a lot of the pre-development activities that are required for the project, and really having a credible development budget as well, I think is certainly puts an applicant in a great place. Bree, anything else you would add, or Teresa?
No, that was a great answer. Thank you.
And just while we're on that, someone asked, did I hear correctly that project managers and teams should be in place 3 months prior to the pre-application?
That is correct. The guidelines certainly, I believe, reference that. If I'm misquoting it, please correct me, but in the guidelines, you will see that we like to see that your team is in place at least 3 months prior to the pre-application. There's a reason for that. Again, you want to come in and be competitive. It is a very competitive process, as you can imagine. And so if you're working with a team already in place, 3 months, you have a rapport with your team. You already, again, are undertaking some of the pre-development activities that are required with your project. And so coming into the pre-application, you're just, on solid ground. So absolutely, you did hear that correctly. We'd like to see that you have that team in place 3 months prior to pre-application.
Great. And someone else said, did I hear correctly that we'll need all the estimates assembled for the pre-application? Bree, how would you answer that?
No, I would say no, you don't need all of them. Ideally, at the time of the pre-application, which Jasenia mentioned is mostly narrative, you will have at least one estimate for the entirety of the project. If you are doing a lot of specialized work like redesigning, reinstalling an HVAC system, you don't need to have the full estimates at the time of the pre-application for that component of it. But as much as you're able to have in hand at the time of the pre-application, it will serve the project well in terms of demonstrating readiness and feasibility. Obviously, if you have a lot of estimates that are still outstanding at the time of the pre-application, there is a risk that costs may increase if the project is invited in. There might be a gap in financing. So as much as you're able to have in hand at the time of the pre-application, that's important. And you can also, within the pre-application, note your timeline for securing the additional estimates. But ideally, you should have some documentation to demonstrate how you are inferring the project's development costs.
Great. I know it's 12. I'm going to put in the chat again, our email and the EEOC team. I think we're going to stay on and keep answering questions, but just for anyone who might want to drop off. There are several questions about leasing, about leased facilities. So for leased facilities, what documentation is most important to demonstrate site control at the pre-application stage, Bree? And for example, how
Sure.
should purchase options or plan ownership transfers be reflected?
Yes, I think this was Althea's question. It's a great question. So at the time of the pre-application, you need to demonstrate some form of site control. So what that means is that you need to have an existing lease in place. You need to have, if you are planning to purchase a building, you need to have some form of an agreement to purchase, a purchase and sale agreement, an intention to purchase, something that is countersigned by both the seller and the buyer. It needs to specify a timeline and the conditions to purchase it. And again, it's really important that that timeline stretches beyond that September 2026 period, because you want to ensure that you have that time ahead of you to complete your due diligence and acquire the site, and not lose site control during the time of the review period. Because as Jasenia mentioned, we only would be able to find out an update on the project at the time of the pre-application, the date of the full application, and then at the site visit. So in terms of purchase, if you own your site, you want to share your deed at the time of the pre-application. The pre-application materials and the checklist gives you all the options as to, if you're purchasing the building, what kind of documents suffice. But again, it's most important to have something signed by the seller and the buyer that explains the timeline and the conditions for purchasing. For leasing, you want to have a current lease in place. And if you are intending to enter into a long-term lease with your landlord or a new landlord, you need to have that documentation at the time of the pre-application. There is a field in the pre-application and your ability to upload permission from the property owner to make these improvements. You can use that document to explain the situation with your landlord. So if you're renting to purchase, you should be able to upload a document that explains that situation. If you have other specific questions about your specific situation, please reach out to us using that eeost.lg@cif-ma.org email.
Great. So I know there were a couple of questions about, can an option to purchase document be dependent on grant approval? Can we apply to purchase a building that we're currently leasing if we have not executed option to purchase without including the renovation work? So
I'd like to say one thing, and that's that although you can use EEOST funds to reimburse you for purchasing a building, you cannot use the EEOST grant funds as the down payment for the building. And the reason for that is that, again, it's a reimbursement. And thinking about the timeline, if you're awarded EEOST, you find out in fall of 2026 that you're awarded, and then you have up to a year to close on the project. So in terms of feasibility, if you are not acquiring the site until after September 2026, it could be really challenging for you to project the costs of the project, the timeline, the cost, because that's so much uncertainty out there. So EEOST is meant to be a reimbursement for projects that are already in development. It is very hard to use it as potential funding for a future project that may not happen until the next 3 to 5 years. Because again, the timeline for it is that if you're awarded funds, you have up to a year to meet all of the project specific and general conditions of the grant, close on the financing, start construction, and then you have to be completed within 2 years after the grant award.
Great, thanks. So someone did ask requirement on by which construction must be completed by. So you said 2 years after the award.
Yes. And in some cases, EEC will grant an extension. But what's really challenging with the EOST is that often there are other sources that may not be committed at the time of the application, such as new markets tax credits, things that are entirely out of your hands as an applicant. So it's all about communication. And, we understand that real estate development is a continuum, things change. So it's about keeping just making sure that the pre-application and full application materials document what is happening now, and as best you can document what the future holds in terms of timeline and documentation. Obviously, we're in unprecedented times with regards to federal funding, certainly. So there's an opportunity to have that within the pre-application and full application. And if you're invited to come in, there'll be an opportunity to discuss the updates at the site visit.
Thanks. There were a few questions before. Hopefully they were clarified when Jasenia was talking about the 50% threshold and the other public subsidies. But Jasenia, someone's following up um, in terms of demonstrating eligibility via the other public subsidies. How would we be eligible this way? What's the minimum required amount as we're filling out this chart? So I guess, and please, Karen, if you want to reach out to us more specifically, we can walk you through it. But how else would you guide people, Jasenia, about how to fill out the main charts versus the other public subsidies chart?
It's a great question. Yeah, certainly as it relates to the public subsidy, doing an anonymous poll with your families, that would be, as I mentioned, a way to determine the percentage of low-income families that you are serving through these public subsidies. But then the first chart certainly relates to any childcare subsidy, slot subsidies that you are receiving. So I would start filling that chart out first to determine based on the families that are enrolled, the subsidized slots that you do have in hand, to determine if you are meeting the 50% threshold. And if you are not, then certainly, again, taking an anonymous poll of your families to determine how many low-income families are receiving other subsidies. And with that, you would add both the contracted subsidy slots as well as the public subsidy to determine if you're meeting that 50% threshold. I hope that answered your question.
Great. When we were talking earlier about having a project manager on 3 months before the pre-application, someone I think was asking, does that also include the whole team? Like, should you have an architect, development consultant, engineers on earlier as well? How would you answer that, Bree?
So I would say at the time of the pre-application, again, ideally, you and your team have been working together for sufficient time to prepare estimates and the timeline and be able to speak to issues pertaining to zoning and permitting and getting the sources in line. So obviously that's very hard to pull together at the last moment. Again, you don't need to have all the answers, you don't need to have all the documentation, but the most competitive projects at the pre-application stage have teams that have been working together that can document these issues. What most folks don't hire at this point is a general contractor, because obviously the project will need to go out to bid if the project is awarded, and state procurement requires at least 3 competitive bids. Again, as Jasenia said, union labor, prevailing wage, that does not apply here unless there are other issues within your site or conditions that would require it. So ideally you have a team in place that's been working together that can present the documentation required. It is very hard if you have not already prepared this application and the materials to kind of jump in at the pre-app and put together a competitive application. So it's, that's something that, maybe next year the project will be better in a better place to apply. But again, if you have questions about readiness in particular, please do reach out to us. We're happy to learn more about your project and provide answers.
Great. And someone did ask, what if you're just hearing about this grant? So I think that speaks to that. It's timing wise, it's a lot to pull together. So someone asked about next year's funding. We are hopeful that there will be funding, but it's allocated each year by the administration. So, but definitely reach out to us and we're happy to talk about your particular project. All right. I think one more question is just clarifying, does the competitive priority related to previously awarded EEOST grants apply if an applicant was awarded a small grant? So the preference points. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that. Sorry to jump in. So projects that were previously awarded a small grant, if there are, obviously you would not apply for exactly the same scope of work for the large grant, but if it's an ongoing project continuation, say it's a project where you were able to replace some HVAC components, but you are redoing the entire building, or no, that would not make the project necessarily less competitive, although EEC likes to ensure that the EEOST resource, which is really scarce, is awarded to as many organizations across as many regions of the state as possible. So I could say it's not a, there's no blanket answer as to whether your project would be less or more competitive, but just ensure that if you were awarded EEOST funds in the past, that this is an entirely different scope of work, and that you best document how this differs from that application and takes it further. Because again, the small grant round is an excellent resource if you have a discrete project like replacing your roof or replacing components of your HVAC, replacing windows, new playground. These are all great small EEOST grant projects. The EEOST large grant program is really about comprehensive improvements to significant and complex construction projects, building a brand new site, expanding your site, redoing all the systems within your site. These are all the types of projects for the EEOST large grant.
Thanks. I think we are done with the questions in the Q&A. I'll turn it to you, Teresa.
Sure. Those were great questions, and we'd like to continue answering as many as possible, just so that you are submitting a very competitive application. So again, any questions that you have for us about your project specifically, please email us. And I know Kira just dropped it in the chat again with our email address. Any questions specifically about EEOST, those questions will be answered through the Q&A that we'll post to Combis around January 22nd. And you can email those questions to Jose Mendez or Ellen Song, and their email addresses are in the chat as well. So thank you all for joining this webinar, and we are excited to get your applications once again. And so thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. I think we'll get started. Good morning, everyone.